So, hi everybody. I'm Greg Farrell. I'm the campaigns manager of the Free Software Foundation. Thanks for the opportunity for letting me introduce the Free Software Foundation, introduce free software itself. If you're not too familiar with free software, of course, I am sitting here in the United States. This is not live, but I am recording it. It is May 7th. I understand it will be broadcast May 9th. So thanks again for the opportunity. Basically, in this talk, I'm just going to give a general overview of the Free Software Foundation, the work of the Free Software Foundation, and touching on the kind of broader free software community in general, how people can get involved in the free software community and advocate for free software effectively, like we do on the FSF campaigns team. That's going to start with a kind of general overview of what free software is. So as an FSF speaker, I'm not literally obligated to go through the free software definition, but I kind of include it in every talk, just because, as I'm sure all the free software supporters in the room right now know, it's a topic that's like not always immediately understood by people. They may have heard the term quote unquote open source or quote unquote Linux, something like that. But in the FSF campaigns team's language, we're always prioritizing freedom and the ethical imperative that software be free. So I will be going through a little bit of that, and then a general overview of what I do all day as the campaigns manager of the FSF. And it's how you can improve your free software advocacy, get more involved in free software yourself so that we can further the movement. So here we go. So you may have heard the Free Software Foundation, you may have heard of GNU, but you may not know exactly what we do. And if you go to fsf.org, you will see in big bold text that the Free Software Foundation is a nonprofit with the worldwide mission to promote computer user freedom. That is one way of putting it. The more succinct and less standard nonprofit language way of putting it might be the FSF believes that every single person on every single computer everywhere should be using free software all the time. They should never be in a situation where they are forced to use non-free software, commonly called proprietary software, because that is an insult to their freedom. It is an unfair power dynamic, and it gives the developer a power over the user that they shouldn't have. And of course, this is more evident in large tech corporations like Apple or Microsoft, but it's a power dynamic that still exists with smaller non-free software developers, whether that's like a game company or something like that. So what the FSF does in all of its work is to just educate the public about software freedom. We founded to be the organizational home of the GNU operating system, which I'll touch on in a minute. And so we're constantly talking about free software. It is the only thing that we talk about. But it's good in that way because as life becomes digital more and more, free software becomes increasingly relevant. So it's never a dull moment when it comes to advocating for free software. And something that we do as part of that is we do our entire work from top down completely with free software, running on free BIOSes on machines that are often very old, but they are the state of the art when it comes to freedom. And as we are the Free Software Foundation, one of our main goals, and we don't state it maybe as often as we should, is that we want to show people that it's possible to run a reasonably sized organization using entirely free software with not using any non-free software at all. So that's one other thing that we do. So the FSF is kind of broadly split into a few different teams. I'm the campaigns manager, of course. There's also the licensing team and the tech team. There's a kind of secret other team called the operations team, which handles the mail and stuff like that. But the FSF licensing team is the steward of the GNU General Public License, the GPL, which is the most popular copyleft license in use today. Copyleft, of course, means that if you get a program that is under a copyleft license, you are legally obligated to give any user downstream, any user who may benefit from your changes, the freedom to do the same things that you did when you received the program. And we defend copyright on the GNU operating system. So GNU uh, is an operating system. It's a collection of many, many, many different packages. Uh, all of those packages are their copyright is held by the FSF, so that if we're ever in a position to where we need to defend the GPL, if the downstream developer of a program should be releasing the source code because a GNU program is licensed under the GPL, but they're choosing not to do that, then that's where we would become involved and, hopefully resolve it amicably, but may end up going to court or what have you, GNU maintain or something. And I could not do it because I got together a list of like 500 people, and I realized like, oh, this is too much for one person or even the 3-person campaigns team. We have to figure out something different. And of course, there's my favorite GNU project, my favorite free software program generally, GNU Emacs, which is what I wrote this presentation in. So uh, it's okay if you use VI, but I use GNU Emacs. Um, and like I mentioned before, the FSF considers proprietary software to be a social injustice, full stop, right? Um, you should never force someone to use proprietary software. You should never be forced to use proprietary software. And something that often gets miscommunicated around this is this idea that, like, if I am, say that I'm an average free software person and I'm using a GNU Linux operating system, but it's not fully free, I may be using the non-free firmware that comes with the Linux kernel or something like this. There's often this like strange feeling of guilt, right? Like I know that I should be using free software, fully free software, but I can't, and I feel bad about that. Well, you shouldn't feel bad about that, right? Like you're the victim in that scenario. It's important to be using the free software that you can at all times, because it's the best for your freedom. But if you can't, that's not something that you're doing wrong. It's something wrong that's being done to you. And that's something that the FSF is trying to kind of campaign more around lately. And on that note, the licensing team that stewards the GPL is also in charge of the FSF's Respect Your Freedom initiative. That's a way for manufacturers to certify that the hardware that you have runs fully free software. So basically, they submit devices to the stuff. The licensing team very intently studies those devices to make sure that they are fully free software, that all of the software running on them is fully free, and that they're compatible with fully free software. So some examples of this are, of course, the refurbished laptops that the FSF uses themselves, but there are also, larger, more expensive computers like those, like the Talos 2. A lot of things running the Power 9 CPU architecture, if those words mean anything to you. Um, and places where you would least expect. But we're the first to admit that there is far less fully free software compatible hardware than there ought to be, right? Like the FSF wants a world where you can go down to the local store and the computer that you purchased is just immediately configured with fully free software. All of the device drivers in it are compatible with fully free software. That's not a world that we are anywhere near getting to, but the FSF is going to continue to exist for as long as it will take to get there. I'm 100% confident of that. But part of what the campaigns team does, it's kind of strange, right? Because we are this 3-person team. The FSF is 10 staffers in total, but the campaigns team is 3 people of that, of which I am one of them. And we are up against literally billions of dollars in marketing from proprietary software companies, right? Like Microsoft, like Apple, Google, X, whatever it is. That's a lot of like advertising money that it's against us or against, not only us, but every other free software person campaigning for free software. And so it's important that we, like solidify our principles as much as possible, and that we, like I mentioned before, be talking about free software all the time, essentially, wherever we can, because somehow, everything becomes a free software issue at some point, just by virtue of how much technology is in the world today. But something else that we do is, the FSF campaigns team is the main point of connection with the global free software community. So if you send a message to the Epistef, typically an email, right? Um, the campaigns team will probably be the people who are answering you, unless it's a kind of financial thing. And so, part of what I do especially is just constantly keeping up in developments in proprietary software more often than free software, right? Because there's always something about to happen or happening that is, something that the FSF needs to talk about. And that's a lot of what I do. Of course, we write articles, we share software freedom, however we can with whoever we can. Um, and that's, the campaigns team work in a nutshell. Touching back on this feeling of guilt that I just mentioned, something that the FSF is working toward in particular is this campaign called the Freedom Ladder, which we've been developing for some time now. And it's important to highlight that, anytime, any single time in your life, when you say no to a non-free program. So when, if theoretically, if I were asked to give this call on Zoom and I said no, that would be a win for the free software movement, right? Because I refuse to free software to use non-free software, and I told someone about it. They know now that I am that person who will annoy them because I refuse to use proprietary software. Every time that you do that is a net win for the free software movement. That's something that the Freedom Ladder is really trying to highlight, right? Um, it's in a nutshell, what we envision it to be is a way that people can say, like, okay, I am on an Android phone, maybe I use a custom distribution of Android, like Lineage OS or something like that, but I want to use more free apps, or I'm on iOS and I want to use more free apps. Like, what do I do? The Freedom Ladder, what we want it to be is a guide in that way. Like, okay, if you're here, then try doing this. If you're here, try doing this. And if you're at the very end, for some reason, uh, you know, congratulations. But if you're at the very end, help somebody else get to the very end, because that's how the free software movement is going to succeed. That's kind of how we've gotten to this point already. The long-term goal of the campaigns team right now is to launch a comprehensive site about that. That is proving to be a little bit more difficult than we thought, because we, want to have it as easily accessible as possible to people who are not in the free software world already. Um, the Freedom Ladder initiative, like, once it is fully launched, you should not have to know words like kernel, firmware, binary blob, proprietary, all of these terms that, jargon that we throw around. The average person just isn't familiar with this, right? If you use the word firmware to someone walking down the street today, there's a pretty good chance that they would not know what you were talking about, right? Um, and so, communicating about that is really difficult, because if you're trying to share free software with somebody and you have to start that conversation by giving the definition for about 9 different terms or something like that, that person is going to tune out very quickly. I've seen it happen like over 100 times, I'm gonna say, uh, where, like, somebody who's kind of new to advocating for free software, let's say, like, "Oh, well, a binary block is blah, 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 a firmware is blah, blah, blah." And by the time that they actually get to the point that they're trying to deliver, that person has just tuned out, and all they wanna do is get out of the conversation. Communicating about free software effectively, especially to someone who isn't technical, is one of the most important and one of the most difficult things you can do as a free software supporter. So that's why we're kind of still working on the Freedom Ladder, still trying to get it out there in a way that um, is accessible to as many people as possible. We're working very hard on that, but it is not ready yet. And I'm gonna go through a few other FSF campaigns before I kind of talk about LibrePlanet and the LibrePlanet community in general. One of our biggest ones is, of course, Defected by Design, which is our campaign against digital restrictions management, DRM. The film industry, the video game industry, the music industry will often use another word for DRM. I'm not going to say that word because what it really is, it's digital restrictions management, right? You are being restricted. There's someone in an office somewhere in Redmond, Washington, who is trying to figure out how can I prevent users from sharing Windows 11? How can I prevent users from, sharing the next version of whatever proprietary software we're going to come out with? Which is it's a free software issue insofar as, if DRM existed in free software, um, it would just be written out because no user wants to be controlled in what they can or can't do with a piece of media, what they can or can't do with a program. Like, one example that we've been using more and more frequently is this, on streaming services, at least in the United States, you're often kind of prohibited by the uh, browser typically from taking a screenshot. I mean, it's a screenshot, like who cares, right? That's DRM. And no sane person would enjoy that feature, right? DRM is comprised of anti-features. And why it's a free software issue is because it's implemented through non-free software, right? Because if it weren't, people would just strip it out and say, here's my version of, Google Widevine level, whatever the highest level is, that will allow you to take screenshots or what have you, and so it's important to be campaigning against DRM, as much as we can, because streaming services are only becoming more and more entrenched in society. There's, streaming services, it does not function in any way differently from downloading a file, period. The only difference is that, that file is being handled in a particular manner and being deleted, immediately after it's been seen or streamed, heard, whatever. And since it's a file, it should be, subject to the same rules that any other file is. And that's DRM, why you might want to refuse to use it. And there's a kind of often there's an overlap between people who are free software people and people who are very concerned about their privacy. One FSF talking point that you may have heard is that you cannot have true privacy without free software, right? If you're using a encrypted messenger and they don't exactly share how their encryption is being done, I'm thinking of WhatsApp when I say this. That's a prompt that they're making to you. Is a company like Meta known for keeping their promises or known for speaking accurately about things like that? You might have a different opinion. I'm going to say no, they aren't trustworthy. And so, privacy is something that you can only verify if you're running free software on that program. And to that end, part of the FSF's work is to encourage more people to encrypt their communications, because starting with in the early 2000s, we became kind of more and more interested in opposing bulk government surveillance, right? As the intelligence agencies in the United States, began kind of collecting more and more data, the FSF began to advocate for encrypting your communications as much as possible. So we set up a guide to encrypting your email, called Email Self-Defense. It's at that URL right there. So that's another initiative that we have. But there's like one, pretty major problem facing free software people in today, right? Like, okay, I'm going to boot up my fully free distribution of GNU Linux. I'm going to open up a browser and I'm going to go to, docs.google.com, right? Well, okay, if I go there, I'm going to immediately be downloading like a 100 megabyte file of proprietary JavaScript, all in one extremely long line of minified JavaScript that no programmer is just really capable of reading, right? And so we're kind of getting to the point as a computing society, I guess, where less than the OS, right? So when that's the case, you need to be able to inspect the JavaScript running on your computer, right? And which you can do, right? Even right now, I can go to Google Docs. I can, right click and say view source or whatever, and I will see what is nominally the source code to Google Docs, but it's just so intensely obfuscated and made deliberately vague by running through a few different programs. Um, that it's just not source code in any kind of useful sense of that word. So to that end, the FSF encourages the development of a particular browser extension called LibreJS, which will, if you visit a site, it will check for license headers in the top of the JavaScript file. It knows different ways to uh, give different signs of obfuscated JavaScript. It's able to detect that. It's not perfect. There's at least one major way of recording JavaScript licenses that LibreJS cannot do yet. It's being worked on, but it's not there yet. But if you're a free software person and you're thinking about these issues, you can't ignore JavaScript, because JavaScript, as much as someone like me is horrified by the idea, it's here to stay, right? It's not going anywhere. So it's an important kind of vector to consider in your free software advocacy, for sure. That brings me to what the LibrePlanet network is, right? So there's all of these ways that you can support free software, all of these ways that you can be talking about free software, but how exactly do you do that? Where would you go? Are there other people who can help you do this? And, if you're watching this, you are at some kind of gathering of these people right now. If you weren't, if you were just one person who, one night found out about free software, found out about GNU Linux, what would you do? If you wanted to share that with people, you could do a one-on-one advocacy, or you could network with people. And from the beginning, LibrePlanet network is what the FSF, it's kind of own way of facilitating communication, what it looks like, basically. So what it is, literally, it's a MediaWiki instance, and the wiki is about free software from start to finish. How it began is the FSF has an annual conference, also called LibrePlanet, but that's only once a year, right? So you can't just be advocating for free software once a year. You need to be doing it constantly if it's going to be gaining any kind of traction. And so LibrePlanet started, essentially as a way for people to network based on where they live, right? So one of the main parts of LibrePlanet is a map, and you can click your country, and then it kind of gets a little bit more fine-grained from there to network with free software people. And that's opposed to, quote-unquote open source people. LibrePlanet is a way of organizing, or is a medium of organizing that the people who you might meet there, who you would collaborate with there, are people who prioritize, the message of freedom rather than the message of like, oh, it will be technically better, better on a technical level if the source code to your program were free. Well, that might be true, but it also might not be true, right? The main advantage is of freedom, of enjoying your freedom, of having control over your own life. And so the LibrePlanet network is what it is a gathering of that particular kind of person, of that particular kind of free software activist, and a place for them to network with each other. So, what in practice would that look like? Say like you've signed up to the LibrePlanet.org wiki, you've kind of browsed around a little bit, but what do you do from there? Well, a lot of it would look like what you're doing right now, essentially, like hosting meetups like this one, sharing strategies on how to advocate for free software. There are a lot of interesting pages on LibrePlanet.org where people have thought through these questions, particularly in the Freedom Ladder. Freedom Ladder, we started developing it in 2020, I think, of this series of conversations like, okay, we are the FSF. We always want to be prioritizing freedom, but look, how do we do that, on a practical level? How can we effectively communicate the next step to what people's, own personal journey to freedom would look like? LibrePlanet is the natural place to do that because that's where we collaborate. That's where we know where the people who care about free software are. The thing that we've done most recently, of course, is on October 4th, 2025, the FSF turns 40 years old. We've been encouraging people to host meetups. about free software, not necessarily about the FSF. Inspect the JavaScript running on your computer, right? And which you can do, right? Even right now, I can go to Google Docs. I can, right click and say view source or whatever, and I will see what is nominally the source code to Google Docs, but it's just so intensely obfuscated and made deliberately vague by running through a few different programs, um, that it's just not source code in any kind of useful sense of that word. So to that end, the FSF encourages the development of a particular browser extension called Libre.js, which will, if you visit a site, it will check for license headers in the top of the JavaScript file. It knows different ways to give different signs of obfuscated JavaScript. It's able to detect that. It's not perfect. There's at least one major way of recording JavaScript licenses that Libre.js cannot do yet. It's being worked on, but it's not there yet. But if you're a free software person and you're thinking about these issues, you can't ignore JavaScript, because JavaScript, as much as someone like me is horrified by the idea, it's here to stay, right? It's not going anywhere. So it's an important kind of vector to consider in your free software advocacy, for sure. That brings me to what the LibrePlanet network is, right? So there's all of these ways that you can support free software, all of these ways that you can be talking about free software, but how exactly do you do that? Where would you go? Are there other people who can help you do this? And, if you're watching this, you are at some kind of gathering of these people right now. If you weren't, if you were just one person who, one night found out about free software, found out about GNU Linux, what would you do? If you wanted to share that with people, you could do a one-on-one advocacy, or you could network with people. And from the beginning, the LibrePlanet network is what the FSF, it's kind of own way of facilitate communication, what it looks like, basically. So what it is, literally, it's a MediaWiki instance, and the wiki is about free software from start to finish. How it began is the FSF has an annual conference, also called LibrePlanet, but that's only once a year, right? So you can't just be advocating for free software once a year. You need to be doing it constantly if it's going to be gaining any kind of traction. And so LibrePlanet started, essentially as a way for people to network based on where they live, right? So one of the main parts of LibrePlanet is a map, and you can click your country, and then it kind of gets a little bit more fine-grained from there to network with free software people. And that's opposed to, quote-unquote open source people. LibrePlanet is a way of organizing, or is a medium of organizing that the people who you might meet there, who you would collaborate with there, are people who prioritize, the message of freedom rather than the message of like, oh, it will be technically better, better on a technical level if the source code to your program were free. Well, that might be true, but it also might not be true, right? The main advantage is of freedom, of enjoying your freedom, of having control over your own life. And so the LibrePlanet network is what it is a gathering of that particular kind of person, of that particular kind of free software activist, and a place for them to network with each other. So, what in practice would that look like? Say like you've signed up to the LibrePlanet.org wiki, you've kind of browsed around a little bit, but what do you do from there? Well, a lot of it would look like what you're doing right now, essentially, like hosting meetups like this one, sharing strategies on how to advocate for free software. There are a lot of interesting pages on LibrePlanet.org where people have thought through these questions, particularly in the Freedom Ladder. Freedom Ladder, we started developing it in 2020, I think, of this series of conversations like, okay, we are the FSF. We always want to be prioritizing freedom, but how do we do that, on a practical level? How can we effectively communicate uh, the next step to what people's own personal journey to freedom would look like. LibrePlanet was the natural place to do that because that's where we collaborate. That's where we know where the people who care about free software are. The thing that we've done most recently, of course, is on October 4th, 2025, the FSF turns 40 years old. We've been encouraging people to host meetups about free software, not necessarily about the FSF, just to kind of show the wider world how far free software has come. It's not just that GNU Linux powers the bulk of, the servers running the internet or something like that. It's that it's really made this like positive impact over countless people. And that's something that we want to celebrate, right? Like that's something that we want to, uh, which we need to celebrate if free software is going to, go further than it has right now. Because right now, more people are using free software than ever before, but they don't know that they're using free software. And I'll touch on that in a second. Here it is. Mobile phone freedom. So, there are right now, uh, particularly particularly if you have an Android phone, there are probably programs in it that are copyrighted by the FSF, or that at least are licensed under the GNU General Public License, not on iOS, but licensed under some free software licenses, most likely one of our free software licenses. Anything that runs the kernel Linux, it is licensed under the GPL v2, which is a license that we wrote in 1991. And so anytime anyone activates a phone for the first time, they're using free software. That's a success in some way. They're literally using the program, but they're still oppressed, right? They're still being, they still don't have software freedom. They deserve free software. There's nothing at all intrinsically different from a phone and a computer. A phone is a computer. It should run free software. The FSF believes that every computer should run free software, right? And of course, it becomes a little bit more complicated than that because, behind iOS or behind Android, there's another operating system called the baseband operating system. I won't go into that too much, but that is one way that the phones are a little bit more complicated than computers. But on an ethical level, there's no separation. You should be able to run fully free software on your phone. And the kind of way that looks right now is Android is nominally free software, right? You might have heard of something called the AOSP or the Android Open Source Project. As it comes out, that's free software. The problem is when it gets combined with, first of all, the baseband operating system, of which, as far as I know, there is no free software baseband operating system that could power the radio communications of a phone. But more than that, when Android gets paired with the Google Play services, for example, or when Android gets paired with most often, basic device drivers like even something as simple as lighting up a screen or turning on and off a Bluetooth network card will typically involve running some non-free firmware. Why that's done, we could talk about it for a long time, but it's kind of just the way that the device peripheral industry works, essentially, right? It's what they've done. They have no real impetus to change that. But there are ways to run a more or less free phone. The best that we can do right now is a project that the FSF sponsors called Replicant. It's a free distribution of Android. And at this point, it's an interesting project, but runs on very few devices. There was a short amount of time where we were able to recommend it. But as the mobile networks that the phones that ran Replicant kind of closed down over time, like the deprecation of 3G in particular, it's not really a phone at this point anymore. The devices that run it basically become tablets because they use outdated mobile phone radio communications. But It's an interesting project. Of course, there are other things like, the hobbyist projects like the Librem 5 or, the PinePhone, things like that. Our perspective is that those are interesting projects, but we haven't had the opportunity to evaluate any kind of, quote unquote Linux phone, um, on a really closely detailed level. Although basically based on, the state of the art right now, there's almost no chance that it would be able to run fully free software. And another way that you can just kind of like use more and more free media or communicate in more of a free way is to use federated social media, right? Like, so from the last time that I gave this talk, Twitter has changed its name to X. Twitter was also taken over by a, let's just say, oligarch. And it's kind of had its own kind of social challenges, but something to remember is that network services are neither free or non-free. They're just there. You are not necessarily doing anything to your software freedom rights in particular if you're on a network service or if you're connecting to a website, something like that. That's not something where free software really enters into play. But where it does matter is if you're supplied software, thereby the server itself, sending you JavaScript or, them necessitating that you use some kind of app, whatever, that software must be free. Uh, and so that's something that we'll always advocate around. But on a practical level, you know, uh, independent of free software, the FSF is interested in helping people avoid government surveillance, especially bulk government surveillance, like the NSA in the United States practices. Um, and to that end, we recommend the use of federated social media platforms wherever possible. Um, do they escape bulk surveillance? No. But what they do is they, kind of diversify the uh, points of failure, more or less. Like if Elon shuts X down tomorrow for whatever, bananas reason he might come up with, where would all that go? It would go away. But if you were federated, I have a uh, server in my house right now that is running a federated social media instance, right? And if I run it in my bedroom and my neighbor runs it, and so on, no one can take down that network, no matter how hard they try. So, in the interest of helping people to avoid censorship, that is something that the FSF has been focused on for a long time, encouraging people to use federated social media like Mastodon. We haven't had the chance to look into Blue Sky too closely. We understand that it can be used with fully free software, but beyond reading the API, I have not done as much Blue Sky research as I probably should have. I confess to that. But any network based on the activity pub protocol, like Pleroma, Mistkey, things like that, they're going to have the same benefit that Mastodon does. We recommend Mastodon because it's the most widespread at the moment, and it's licensed under the AGPL, which of course we wrote, which is a version of the GPL v3 that's specifically intended for software served over the network. So we can advocate for Mastodon, because of that. But independent of like specific programs or telling people how do I, you should use federated social media, or you should use a freer phone or free apps if you can. How do you do it in general? I mean, and the way that we've found successful over our long history, and the way that I found successful, even before I worked at the FSF, when I was just a random free software uh, advocate, essentially, is just to encourage people to say no. The hardest thing to do, it seems, is to just say no to a non-free program, like I mentioned earlier. Um, and there's a very insidious network effect to that, right? Like if I am a student and I'm required to use, Zoom, or if I'm required to take my exam through this non-free program that will, incidentally spy on me the entire time I'm doing my exam, uh, what do I do? And this is a very serious problem. The FSF hears from students I would say, at least a few times a year where there's this student who's required to use proprietary software for their schooling and, is unsure what to do. And it's very difficult to know like what to recommend in that situation, right? We've had students who say like, I will take an F in this course because an F in the United States is the lowest grade that you can possibly get. I don't know if that carries it over here. But I will fail this course intentionally because I want to take a stand. There are people in the world who do that. And that's, impressive, but we can't all be doing that. And that's why we need to kind of just normalize saying no to a non-free program. That's one of the best things that you can do. Um, and we need to be advocating, free programs as a kind of positive advocacy where we can, right? Like there's it requires some tact, right? Especially in, the early 2000s when GNU Linux just wasn't completely there yet. It's debatable whether you were really doing effective free software advocacy if you said, "Oh, you should try, you know, GNU Linux. You have to spend about 3 hours setting it up, and you have to buy this particular graphics card, and you have to, you know, edit the MBR boot record of your motherboard of your hard drive in such a way that blah blah blah. This goes on for an hour." Did that really help the free software movement? I mean, yes, but you need to have tact, when you choose the things to recommend, especially when they're to people who are not free software people or who are not immediately going to be persuaded by the ethical argument. And, the way to do that is just to find what programs or what apps are the most well polished for the normal person and to say, "Hey, have you tried this?" One example of this, Microsoft has Office 365, which is kind of what they've collapsed Microsoft Word into. And, if somebody's in the position where they're like, "Oh, I need to pay for this subscription and I don't want to, what do I do?" One program you can easily recommend in that situation is to say, "Oh, no, don't use Office 365 and Microsoft Word. Use LibreOffice and LibreOffice Writer." It's good to have a kind of working vocabulary of what programs are effective to tell people about, in that way. And like I mentioned before, a lot of the time there is technical advantage to using free software. And that I mean that the free software program is technically on a technical level better. It may have more features, it may be more stable, run on more operating systems, whatever. But a lot of the times that's not the case. A free software program that is targeting some kind of obscure field um, may not be as polished as the one that proprietary one, right? Like we see this a lot, especially in media production, but it was more of a thing uh, a while back, right? Like for a while, the GIMP is the GNU image manipulation program. The GIMP was not in a place where we could say, you know, oh, if you use Photoshop, you should just switch to GIMP, right? Because it had all the same things. That wasn't 100% true, as 10 years ago or something like that. Situation was a lot better now. But what do you do in situations where the free program isn't as, technically better as uh, as the non-free program? Um, and in that moment, you just have to kind of assess the situation, right? You have to kind of think to yourself, okay, if I advocate for this free program to this person, if I tell them to use, let's just say, let's go with LibreOffice. If I tell them to use LibreOffice, how is that going to go? Are they more likely to use it and have a positive experience and then want to use more free software? Or are they more likely to say like, "Oh my God, I don't know, this free software stuff is too much for me. I'm just going to stick with Windows and Microsoft Word and blah, blah, blah." It's important to know how to navigate that situation and to able to think about that on the fly when you're just having a conversation with people. That's something that, we at the FSF have had the privilege of doing it because that's what we do all day. But if you're just a student or if you're just, like an accountant somewhere or something, the only way that you're going to develop that is through practice, and the way to get more practice is to network with as many free software people, as you can. So, knowing that is important, but if you really don't know what to do, uh, the way that what I personally think you should do, this is not an FSF position exactly. What I think you should do is just to kind of always emphasize the ethical. If you don't know what to do, emphasize the ethical because, you know, that's something where we will always have the advantage over non-free software, period. Um, we will always be in a position where we can say, if you use this program, you can share it with other people. If you use this program, you can know empirically and for a fact that it is not spying on you when you can't know that with the other program. Uh, Knowing those situations and knowing how to navigate them is very important. So if all else fails, keep to the ethical. It will sometimes get you where you need to go. Um, talking about free software is not the only way that you help the free software movement. You can also volunteer. And of course, during this talk, I've kind of harped a lot on local stuff because, you know, I personally have had the most success in local stuff, even before coming to the FSF. And the way to really get people passionate about free software, I've found it's to kind of take them or help them, better. They're not better than taking them. You can help them take themselves uh, to this, greater place of freedom, to using more and more free software, becoming a free software advocate. Uh, you know, One-on-one communication, face to face, is just really unparalleled when it comes to that particular thing. And of course, that's why we run LibrePlanet Wiki to kind of help people coordinate not only online meetups, but one-on-one meetups. Those are the ones that we really like to see. But, we also want the FSF is very focused on spreading, the concept of free software. But we're free software people. We use free software all day. So we want the programs themselves to get better. And to that end, we recommend that people get involved in their favorite free software project, the one that they use every day, whether it's just filing bugs or writing documentation or, contributing 2,000 lines of ANSI C to whatever program you're using. Wherever you're at, there's almost definitely something that you can do for the free software program that are particularly passionate about or that you use more than others. Um, and I encourage you to kind of like try and figure that out. A lot of the times, the bug trackers of these programs will have bugs that are tagged, beginner or newcomer or something like that. And there are ways that the maintainers signal to people that, okay, this is an issue that a, reasonably motivated newcomer to our project who's never contributed to, GNU Geeks or whatever, could tackle by themselves. Finding those is like a really good way to get started in contributing to a free software project itself, and just kind of furthering free software in a way that's not um, spreading the message exactly. Uh, but if you want to support the FSF in particular, the way that you do that, the best way you can do that is, unfortunately, it's true, it's financial. You can become an associate member of the FSF. Some people think, I talk to them, that the FSF has a lot of corporate sponsorship because, of course, we hold the copyright to GNU and write the GPL and blah, blah, blah. That is absolutely not true. Over 90% of the FSF's funding comes from associate members. It comes from people, giving their annual donation to the FSF. That signals to us like, yes, there are people out there in the world who, use free software, who are running free software, and they're signaling to us that they support us, the FSF, in our work for free software. So if you want to support the FSF in particular, what you can do is become an associate member. That will help us a lot. And in addition to this kind of like very positive feeling of well-being that you will get, you will also get some cool stuff. It will get you access to our Jitsi Meet server, so you can do encrypted voice calls, our member forum, and a bootable USB card with Triskel GNU Linux pre-installed. That's a fully free distribution of GNU Linux, and you can do that at that URL, fsf.org/join. And I think that's it for in terms of slides. Um, Thanks for the invite. It was short notice, but I hope that have given you a perspective to consider that you have not done so already. There was probably some overlap there in terms of what you already may know, but we're very grateful for the opportunity to speak to anyone anywhere about free software. So thank you, Delta, for contacting us. Thanks to anyone involved coordinating this event. Um, you know, it's fun for me to always get to talk about free software. So thanks very much. Happy hacking. See you later.